Hello and welcome to Code to Cloud, and I'm your host as always, Kevin Evans, and today I am joined by yet another esteemed colleague from Microsoft, Flora. Flora, do you want to introduce yourself? Tell us what you do.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. My name's Flora, and I'm a product manager on the Azure Linux product team here at Microsoft. And specifically, I focus on the Azure Linux container host for AKS. So, what first party and third party external users use today to consume Azure Linux. So, excited to chat about Azure Linux and our new release, Azure Linux 3.0.
Awesome. Now, I think it was about 2 years ago, maybe a bit longer, and there was an announcement that Microsoft had released its own Linux distribution. I think it broke the internet, right? It was crazy times. So, you know, it's amazing to see that we've got to 3.0. So I thought it'd be a great time for us to have a quick session on Code to Cloud, right? Talk about the new features, what's happening next, that kind of thing. So I'll hand it over to you and I'll try and ask some really good questions along the way.
Absolutely. Yeah, that sounds great. I will just share my screen to pull up a little slide for us today. Zoom out a little bit. Oops.
Me and Flora, by the way, have had the best luck already with this session.
Seriously. All
Knowing
right.
that this PowerPoint's up on the screen, the demo gods are on our side at last.
Yeah, this is a huge win. Okay, great. Yeah, so today I think that sounds like a great plan. Maybe I'll start with just providing a bit more context into what Azure Linux is. And then yeah, excited to chat about the new release 3.0. So you kind of called it out at a high level. Azure Linux is Microsoft's own Linux distribution, and we supply the node operating system for AKS. Um, it is a Linux OS that's RPM based. So if folks are familiar with other RPM based distros, things like Red Hat Linux, it might feel somewhat familiar to that. But ultimately, it's based purely on upstream components. And we did release Azure Linux internally at Microsoft over 3 years ago. And then
3 years.
yeah, I know, right? Time flies. And then we've been generally available externally on AKS for over 1 year now. And Azure Linux 3.0 specifically is the next major release of Azure Linux, essentially bringing updates to all the core components of the distro. So, our design decision when we were building 3.0 was to upgrade the packages and components to be the latest upstream version or the latest upstream LTS version at the time that we were building 3.0. Because kind of one decision we've made with Azure Linux is that during the life cycle of a given release, so like let's say given the life cycle of Azure Linux 2.0, the current release, we actually opt to keep many of the major components of the distro stable. So things like containerd, the kernel, runc, we're not actually bumping the major versions of those components, and instead we opt to like backport any like secure or security patches or like critical bug fixes. So we opt for this like stable yet secure approach, because generally our customers feel that with less updates come, less changes and potential regressions to their systems and their workloads. So with all that being said, when we do reach, however, the end of a life cycle of a version of our distro, so for example 2.0, and think about upgrading to 3.0, we now have this opportunity to bump all of these components and bring them closest to the upstream versions. So yeah, that slide there calls out a couple of the changes in the versions that we've decided on. To highlight a few of those, the kernel went from 5.15 to the latest upstream LTS version 6.6. Um, Containerd went from 1.6 in 2.0. We're actually in preview with 3.0 on AKS today
Right.
with Containerd 1.7.13, but we're working right now with the AKS team to actually make Containerd 2.0 the default when we do GA 3.0 in AKS, which is great because 2.0 brings a lot of benefits like the new security feature, user namespaces, and other updates to just enhance the stability and performance of Containerd. Um, Run C likewise is going to 1.2. System D got bumped from 250 to 255. And then OpenSSL got a huge bump from 1.1 before to now 3.3. So bringing a lot of security benefits there. And yeah, I guess just last thing I'll touch on right now is just that 3.0 is available in preview today. So we previewed on AKS 1.31. So today, if customers are using AKS 1.31, they would need to register our like Azure Linux v3 preview feature flag, at which point, if they start deploying new nodes or new clusters with Azure Linux, it would start defaulting to our 3.0 preview image. So
Aw-
yeah,
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, we do have like a bit of a release strategy, right? With breaking changes as we call it, right? So this is like
right.
incremental. This sounds like this is more of a we're just refreshing everything that's dependable at the moment to make sure things are secure and up to date, right? But yeah, there's a lot of great changes, especially around the SSL there piece as well. I mean, a lot of
Yeah,
folks are going to be
absolutely.
screaming for that, right?
I know, right? Yep.
Awesome. Okay. What do you have for us next? Is there any other?
Yeah. Totally. Well, I think it would be interesting to talk a little bit about how Azure Linux is actually used internally here at Microsoft because we've seen some
Ooh.
real incredible growth over the past couple of years, and new exciting use cases that some folks might not be aware of. So, as I mentioned, we released Azure Linux over 3 years ago internally here at Microsoft. And we actually build it internally to be a general purpose distro. So it powers a wide variety of use cases here at Microsoft. And then we made the decision as kind of a step one to make it externally available via the Node operating system on AKS. But internally here at Microsoft, we now power over 30 million first party cores. And over 60% of the internal Linux usage at Microsoft is coming from Azure Linux today. Um, and it's specifically looking at just a first party usage of AKS here at Microsoft, we actually have over 75% of the Linux usage running on Azure Linux. So it's become quite critical to the success of Microsoft, and really grown to be the predominant Linux distribution.
That's did you say 30 million? What was that cause? Did you say at the beginning?
30 million first party cores are actually running on Azure Linux today.
That is insane. So
I know.
what you're saying is our business is running on Azure Linux, right? From the sound of things, right? That's
That
uh that's quite, an achievement, right, in itself. And obviously showcases our faith in it as well, right? So
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and to call out some examples that comprise that grand 30 million. There's a lot of different teams with different use cases here at Microsoft running Azure Linux. So the first one that we like to call out is that AKS actually runs on Azure Linux. So the AKS infrastructure is running Azure Linux. And what that means is even if you are provisioning nodes with an operating system other than Azure Linux, the underlying control plane for AKS is actually running on Azure Linux. Um, we also are not the default SKU in AKS today, but we are seeing new AKS SKUs start defaulting to the Azure Linux distro.
Right.
Yeah, so AKS Automatic is an example of this.
Yep.
Um, AKS Automatic, for those who aren't familiar, is basically AKS, except Azure is really managing more of it for you. So you don't even have to manage like the guest nodes yourself. That responsibility shifts over to Azure, and the default OS for those nodes that Azure is provisioning and managing for you is actually Azure Linux underneath the hood there.
That going back to that AKS piece. So
Yeah.
when you spin up an AKS cluster, there's another cluster underneath the hood that's spinning up that resource. Like that just blows my mind, right? It's like it's pretty
Absolutely.
awesome, right?
I know. Yeah, yeah. Pretty awesome.
The actual
Um,
platform, right? But yeah, okay, that's
yeah.
really good to know.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, no, it's exciting to see all of the growth and the AKS underlay with Azure Linux. Um, and then yeah, beyond the direct AKS team, there's plenty of other services running Azure Linux. So Office runs Azure Linux, Defender runs Azure Linux,
Security stack.
Xbox.
Oh wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
security. Yes, absolutely. Xbox runs Azure Linux. Um, Other core app services and Azure services. And then outside of Azure, so within Azure, about 20 million of those Azure Linux cores are from within Azure. The other 10 million are actually coming from LinkedIn. So LinkedIn recently migrated their entire infrastructure over to Azure Linux as well. So that's another about like 10 million cores that they're actually running on bare metal. So yeah, it's just kind of it's exciting to see that Microsoft has gotten their own mission critical workloads running on Azure Linux.
I mean, talk about like a good stress test, right? Like you've got Xbox, Office, right? Like, LinkedIn. These are all platforms that are just being randomly hit throughout the day, right? Spinning up
Right.
resources and everything else. And it's running our own version of Linux, right? That we've developed in house. It's good to see it in action, right? You know, wait, wait until I tell my son that it runs Xbox. He's going to be like, what? Because he always calls it the penguin, right? That's when I talk about
Right.
Linux, he goes, "That's the penguin, right?" And I go, "Yeah." So wait until I talk to him about this later on.
That's the one. Yeah, no, let me know what he says. But yeah, no, no, it's great to see. And it's good to be able to, as you said, like it is a bit of a stress test and we can kind of instill a little bit more confidence in our third party users by just saying like, hey, yeah, we're asking you to try this, but look at how successful it has been internally at Microsoft first. So it's great that we've been able to build up that first party usage before even going third party with the distro.
Awesome. So by default, it's not what you're saying. Is it still a choice in AKS? Right? If I was spinning up a new AKS cluster today, do I still have to go in and choose Azure Linux, or is it becoming? I think you were mentioning it's going to become more mainstream further down the road. Is that the plan? Or
Yeah, so correct. It's still the default in AKS today. Or sorry, it is Azure Linux is not the default in AKS
I thought
today.
I'd got it wrong then.
Yeah, yeah, no, apologies. Yeah, Azure Linux is not the default in AKS today. That remains Ubuntu. It is like, potentially later down the line something we would explore, but it is just a bit of a sensitive change to make because Ubuntu has been the default for so long. So it's exciting to see us becoming the default for new SKUs. But today, I wouldn't say that there is like anything on the immediate roadmap for making Azure Linux the default.
Okay. I mean, there's nothing but love for Ubuntu, right? Let's just make
Right.
that clear.
Yeah, yeah.
I've been using it personally for 20 years or so, right? Like it is what it is, right? It's a
Mhm.
stalwart, so it's good to see. That's what I like about Azure. Someone used the analogy of ice cream, right? Was
Yeah.
we don't care what flavor of ice cream you like, we're just gonna have them all ready for you, right? So you can pick the flavor you want, right? So that's really good. Um,
Nice. Yeah, I like that analogy.
you can use that one, right? Another product
Yep.
manager used that one a couple of years ago. I've been using it ever since. Okay, so like in terms of is there anywhere anyone could keep up to date with like the release versions of Azure Linux, right? Is it on GitHub, right? Is it on like or is it just bedded into the platform? Like what kind of options do folks have for keeping
Yeah,
up
good
to date?
question. Yeah, there's a couple of different options. We are on GitHub today, so you can pull our monthly releases directly from there. You can also just use the AKS release tracker. And on that tracker, and I can share a link to that, but on that tracker, you can pull or track the monthly Azure Linux release, the new node image, and customers can stay up to date with that image as well. But generally, we release an updated Azure Linux image on about like a monthly cadence.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, I mean, I've sat in operations teams before, and you know, I remember me and the security team would go through the next version, right? And it would normally be the security team chasing my tail, right? Going, you need to go to the next version because it patches this vulnerability, right? So it's probably a good one to keep an eye on.
Totally. Right, right.
Awesome. Um, Apart from that, is there anywhere like I know there's a lot of community calls, right, with different product teams. I didn't know if the Azure Linux team had one, or is it just best to stay up to date with the was it the AKS tracker, did you say, and the GitHub release page?
Yeah, so I would say both of those are great for getting just our new monthly image, but in terms of staying up to date on like news and new like features or updates from the team, there's a couple of different like forums or mechanisms. So one you called out is that we have a community call every other month, and these community calls are great. The next one is January 23rd, I believe. And basically every community call we showcase some demos, typically coming from users in the community showcasing their like use cases of Azure Linux. We also on our GitHub page publish a like external facing product roadmap. So
Awesome.
we'll walk through that roadmap in more depth in these community calls. Um, and then also, it's just like a time for users to get together and learn more about how other folks are using Azure Linux, get support from the Azure Linux team. And, we as the Azure Linux team also get to receive, feedback and insights from users in that call, which is great too, because that can directly shape our product roadmap going forward. So those are another a great opportunity to learn about updates from the team. As I mentioned, yeah, our GitHub, we also use GitHub issues. So users or customers can post like questions or start discussions on GitHub issues. And that's something that the Azure Linux team is monitoring and can respond there. Um, We've also been posting on the Microsoft Tech community, posting blogs there to the
Right, right.
Linux and open source page. So that's another a great place to watch for new updates. So we released a 3.0 preview blog not too long ago, and we'll plan to release a GA one in the new year as well. Um, and then I would also just say that our Microsoft Learn documentation, we're constantly refreshing. So that's another place to just monitor to see new features and any updates related to Azure Linux.
So we'll include everything in the show notes.
Yeah,
But I'm a big advocate of our community calls. Like, you'll find a lot of Microsoft folks turn up to them, right? Because it's the source of truth, right? You're getting it directly from the product teams, and I'm always learning something new on those calls. Like, and especially when the customers, right, people out in the community are the use cases that they come with are just incredible sometimes. Like the scenarios that they'll use some of our tools in is like, whoa, we didn't even know you could do that, right? And I just spurs on like the inspiration sometimes, right, for the next release. So
absolutely. I completely agree. I walk away from every community call having learned something from our users. So yeah, I think they're super valuable. And it's really cool when folks bring demos of their use cases. It's just great to see like Azure Linux outside of the, I don't know, internal Microsoft setting. I think yeah, those are a great forum.
it's more realistic, right?
Yeah, right.
So, but yeah, um, have you got anything else for us, or was that everything on your list today?
Yeah, I mean, that was the majority. I'm happy to chat about any like of the security or performance offerings of Azure Linux, but
Let's do that,
um,
right? Because the last conversation I had was a couple of years back, so you might not have this information, but it was with Jim, right?
right.
And he said like the footprint was like 70 meg or something like that, right? For the OS, and we were like blown away. Right? 'Cause we were like, that's crazy. So from a security and performance point of view, like I thought that was amazing. But yeah, is there anything you want to touch on that, right? Around the performance, the security, the operability of it?
Yeah, totally. I think a couple of things. The first one, maybe building right off of what you said, is that we do offer a smaller container host image on AKS. So the rough numbers are that we offer about 200 to 250 packages less than other distros
Oh,
on AKS.
right.
And
Okay.
so, yeah, so we basically only select the packages that we know are required to run containerized workloads. And we're intentional about removing any packages that A are unnecessary or B have a like rich CVE history, so things like text editors or like GUIs or unnecessary drivers. And I would say that this like architectural decision, as you correctly called out, does manifest itself in security improvements, performance improvements, right? We've noted with our customers that we just have fewer CVEs on our image, which kind of makes sense if we have fewer packages. So there's a smaller footprint, a reduced attack surface. And so we have fewer CVEs, which leads to less, updates and potential downtime. And then also it has led to performance improvements as well. So we have some of the fastest cluster operation times on AKS, largely accredited to this smaller footprint. Um, so yeah, I think that has definitely led to some of the benefits our customers have experienced from like a security and performance perspective. There are some other, like, decisions that we make too. One of them related to security is hardening the kernel with secure defaults.
Right.
So yeah, when we build the distro, we set kernel configs fairly aggressively to lock down certain features. And one example of this is that we have kernel enforcement on. So we
Right.
don't
Okay.
actually, yeah, load any unsigned drivers. All drivers that get loaded in the kernel need to be signed with a trusted key. And basically, if not, we just don't load the driver. Um, and then one other security capability I wanted to quickly touch on that I'm not sure if as many folks are aware of um, on Azure Linux is this thing called pod sandboxing. It's something that AKS is offering today, and it runs on Azure Linux. And the idea behind pod sandboxing is basically in a single node, you can run pods side by side, where let's say one pod is like running as like a traditional namespace container. And then another pod is like quote unquote sandbox or has its own like kernel, own system D, own like core components so that it's kind of entirely isolated. So this additional like layer of separation isolation basically provides defense in depth against any untrusted apps that you might be running. So pod sandboxing is a feature on AKS in preview today that is actually running on Azure Linux, but it's another kind of security capability that we're offering to our customers.
Wow. Sounds like security is the priority, right? Which, the man upstairs, he said it, right? He mandated it. But it's good to hear, right? So we've got like a reduced attack surface, right? We've got
Right.
security in depth, and now we've got like signed drivers, and now we've got sandboxing capabilities, right?
Hmm.
There's so much there. I can imagine a lot of our like industry regulated customers, right, and community members, right, will be chomping at the bit for that kind of stuff. I can see a lot of use cases in the FSI space, right, especially
Right.
within banking and that kind of thing. But yeah, that's incredible to think about, and yeah, less is more when it comes to containers, right? So
Seriously.
what do I need to do my job, right? Is a catchphrase I use quite a lot, right? And that's effectively what you've done there, right? It's what's the bare bones that we need just to get it going, right? So it's an efficient
Absolutely.
architecture design, right?
Yeah, yeah. But no, you called it out exactly. I think security is like a one was just a critical driver reason for why we built Azure Linux. And throughout the past couple of years, that has been no exception, and definitely no exception with the release of 3.0.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm loving this. Can't wait to advocate this and get my hands on it myself.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. And yeah, I guess just in terms of what to look for next, we are planning on making 3.0 on AKS generally available on AKS 1.32, which will roll out in the new year. So you can expect that in January, February time. Um, that I know, like
Let's say February, right?
let's always say February.
It's
um,
a bit of a running joke, right? Internally, sorry, but
no,
yeah, when
totally.
we ask for a date from the product team, I always go, we'll choose February, right?
Exactly. Let's keep this February. Um, yeah, so at that point, 3.0 will become the default on AKS 1.32.
Awesome. Awesome sauce. Right.
Awesome.
Well, Flora, I've learned a ton. I think this has been very technically orientated, even though it wasn't a technical demo, right? There's a lot of moving parts when it comes to a Linux operating system as it is, right? I think there's been a
Mhm.
great breakdown. I'm going to double click on the sandboxing stuff. That sounds really cool. So yeah, that's something I'm going to look out for. But yeah, if people want to follow, connect with Flora, where should they head to, right? Where could they
Totally.
find you?
Yeah, yeah. I think you can find me on LinkedIn. I can include that in the comments of the video, or it's Flora Taagen on LinkedIn. So that would be an easy way to connect, and I'd love to chat about any of this in more detail with anyone who's interested. And yeah, thank you so much for having me, Kevin. This was a great conversation. Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Awesome. No, we're great to have you on. But yeah, thank you to Flora. Thank you to our community. Again, if you want to, continue the conversation after this episode, don't forget to go to connect.codescloud.io, and you can find all of our socials there, including our Discord server. Everything that we've talked about today, I'll include in the show notes below, so you can jump on the Azure Linux community call. I'm going to be there, right? Because, again, I'm going to get the information the same as you guys, right? So it's going to be awesome. But yeah, thank you very much, and we'll catch you on the next one. Goodbye for now.
Yeah.